to the Achieving Equity with Results-Based Accountability webinar. Today's date is July 13, 2016, and I guess the timeliness of this webinar couldn't be any better considering the recent events that are taking place in our country. So we trust that it will be a wonderful experience, a wonderful opportunity to share and learn as we dig deeper into the topic of achieving equity with results-based accountability. I am Marquez Frazier. I am an impact consultant with Clear Impact, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. And joined with us today is also my colleague, Eileen Finn, who will be in a support role helping us to move the polling and the questions along in today's webinar. So, Eileen, do you want to say hello to everyone?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, and I hope that you get a lot of good information out of this to use in your communities and your work. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Eileen. And so before we move forward in the webinar, we wanted to briefly just go over a few rules of engagement. As you all have noted, you all are muted during the webinar. We just thought that would be a good way to reduce noise and to make sure that we are able to hear everyone clearly as we present the information today. The webinar is designed to be interactive. With that being said, there will be a few poll questions throughout the webinar. There will be an opportunity to ask questions, and there's a questions tab in the menu bar on the right side of your screen. Simply type your questions there, and we'll be able to address them as we go through the webinar. And if for whatever reason we don't get a chance to go through all of the questions as we go through the webinar today, feel free to shoot me an email. My email will be provided to you at the end of the webinar, and so feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll make sure that the presenters and panelists get an opportunity to follow back up with you. Post the webinar, there's going to be a survey that will be sent to you all. We invite you all to participate in the survey, and as a result of participating in the survey, you all will receive a recording of today's webinar. So please do participate in the survey. Next, we wanted to just do a high-level overview of the topic today. Dan, would you mind going to the next slide? And so Clear Impact is the organization hosting this webinar, and we're a performance management software company that also has a consultant component. So specifically what we do is we help to track performance programs. We measure impact. We report on the results, all for the purpose of improving the lives of communities worldwide. And so specifically, we offer 3 different services through software, training, and other services, including workshops, webinars, and conferences. And specifically, our scorecard is one of the tools that we use to track performance. And so we'll talk about our scorecard in a bit more detail today. But as a broad overview, its primary purpose is to serve as a communication tool in order to help organizations and individuals track their performance in a way that is simplified, standardized, and helps to measure and improve progress in your work. And as a training organization, we work with a lot of different organizations to collaborate, set and track, and measure different community initiatives. And so it ranges in the size and scope of the initiatives. And our framework of results-based accountability is all about starting with the ends and working our way backwards. And so we'll see a lot of that come up in our conversation today. And so next we want to talk about the services that we provide as an organization. Again, this has a lot to do with the trainings, the webinars, the workshops, and things along those lines. As a consulting agency, we provide support to a number of organizations, helping them to improve their performance in order to make communities better worldwide. And so today's webinar, again, our topic today is Achieving Equity with Results-Based Accountability, presented by Dan Duncan and Simran Noor. Racial equity is just and fair inclusion into a society in which we all can participate, prosper, and reach our full potential. In America today, from infant mortality to life expectancy, race and other related factors can sometimes predict how well someone will do. To achieve equity, we work to close the gap so that race does not predict one's success, while at the same time also improving outcomes for all, To accomplish this, we must target and so in order to go a bit more deeply around this topic, we have invited Dan Duncan, who's a senior consultant with the Clear Impact Organization, to be one of our presenters. And Dan comes with us with over 25 years of experience with the asset-based community development and collective impact frameworks. Dan, through experience to help clients and communities achieve even greater community level results. Simran Noor is the Vice President of Policy and Programs with the Center for Social Inclusion, and she's a senior level manager who provides programmatic leadership throughout the management and coordination of all program staff, strategy development, program management, organizational networking, alliance building, and relationship management. Also in this role, her primary responsibilities include programmatic strategy, planning, implementation, staffing, and evaluation. So we're delighted to have you both join us today, and we're honored for the presentation that you're about to lead.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we're excited to jump into the webinar. But as a starting point, we'd like to see who's on the call, who's participating in the webinar. And so we have 3 poll questions that we'd like to ask just to get started. So Eileen, if you could please walk us through the polls. The first 3 poll questions. All right, if you want to go ahead and show those first poll results. All right, as you can see, it's pretty well split between primarily government and nonprofit organizations with a few educational organizations. Let's go on to the second poll question. All right, let's go ahead and show the poll results for the second question. And as you can see, majority of participants have some knowledge of results-based accountability, but we have a good segment of folks that are going to be introduced to RBA for the first time. So that's very exciting. And we have about 25, almost a quarter of you that are very familiar with RBA. Now let's move on to the last poll question. Probably the most important one is, are you currently engaged in racial equity work? All right, that's go ahead, Eileen, and show the results from that one. Very exciting that most of you, a large percentage, are involved in racial equity work today. So we hope we can give you some new tools and examples that will help you in your work today. So let's move forward. And one of the kind of interesting stories to get started. As my computer froze up, so give me a second here to figure that out. I do apologize. There we go. So I apologize for that short problem there. One of the I live in the Tampa Bay area, and one of the interesting stories that was in the newspaper last year was around the issues with the school system in Pinellas County, and the value of not disaggregating data So there is in that community, the newspaper brought to the forefront that in the early 70s, the school board segregated countywide. They adopted policies so that none of the schools could have more than 30% black students. They did all the things they needed to do, and they had some great results in relation to that. Literally none of the schools were ranked lower than a C, and they were all improving. But in 2007, the school board had abandoned desegregation and went back to neighborhood schools that very quickly related in de facto segregation. And in just 8 years, they were able to turn the 5 schools with from the county's black neighborhoods into some of the worst schools in Florida. And so you can see by disaggregating the data, this chart shows the 5 schools on the right where they have the most black students. Literally were able to move through the years into a total segregated school system again. And again, they were not paying any attention to the results of that and were not doing anything special for those schools. So those schools ended up having the worst school test results. And you can see there are the schools on the right, those 5 schools, in relation to their the students passing reading and math. And again, by not paying a consequence of focusing through a racial equity lens, they literally ended up with some very bad results. But currently, over the last 2 years, with a new superintendent and with a new commitment on behalf of the school board to those schools, literally within a year they were able to begin to turn around some of those results because they began to develop special programming down there. They began to make sure that they had some of their best teachers in those schools. And again, looking through a racial equity lens, they realized that what they needed to do to help all schools and all students succeed, they had to pay attention to some of the key issues in those 5 schools. So this is a good example, a real-life example in my local community of the importance of looking through a racial equity lens in the work we do. So what I'd like to do now is talk about results-based accountability. Again, for those that aren't familiar, it was developed by Mark Friedman when he wrote his book, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough. And it's a process for improving lives by focusing on performance and using data strategically. And the framework is a way that we can increase equitable conditions of well-being for children, youth, and families in our communities, and we can improve the quality and effectiveness of our programs. So RBA is not just about compliance, it's about using information strategically to improve programs and activities. The 2 key principles for achieving measurable impact is starting with ends, working backwards to means, because often we start with the means and try to improve what we're already doing, which is a good goal, but it may not be adequate, which is why Mark wrote the book, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough. The other principle is a data-driven, transparent decision-making, using data and information strategically so that we can do improve the activities that we need to improve. So RBA in a nutshell, we call this the 2-3-7. There are 2 kinds of accountabilities, 3 kinds of performance measures, and 7 questions from ends to means. The 2 kinds of accountability focus on both population or community level results and performance or program level results. And at the population or community level, we focus on results about the well-being of populations for whole populations, again, all people in our children in our county, all families in our state, people in the eastern USA. So we're focusing on population accountability. And then at the performance accountability, we're focusing on the people that we're actually able to reach, the customers or the clients or the recipients of the services that we offer or provide in a community. So again, 2 levels, population, which impacts the entire population in an area, and performance accountability, where we're actually focusing on people that we are working with effectively in our programming. And so the means is the performance accountability, and is the population accountability. And so population accountability focuses on all youth succeed in school, and it's important that results focus on a common language that the community will understand. And to measure our impact at the community or population level, we use what we call indicators. So indicators are data that giving, and they can be approximate because we're really looking at trends I'll talk about a little later. So for example, if our result is all children in our community succeed in schools, some good indicators would be the high school graduation rate, percent of students performing at grade level, or the overall attendance rate. So population indicators, just to take a second, population indicators are collected from community level data, like the census, or the American Community Service, State Department of Health, State Department of Education, county health departments. Indicators are not collected from agency or program client data, so we don't just roll up client data to create population indicator data, because we're really talking about the entire population, all the kids, all the families in a community, not just those people that are in the programs or services that we offer. So population-based accountability would be very clear that the whole community is accountable and responsible for achieving population level measures. For the programs or services, the means that we offer, the program managers or the people delivering those services are responsible for making sure that they achieve the results that are necessary. So 3 kinds of performance measures. How we measure this is we have 3 kinds of measures. And those are how much did we do, how well did we do it, and is anyone better off? And that information provides us the data that we need to make the mid-course adjustments that are necessary for continuous improvement. And so just to give you an example of those, how much did we do? That's where we're actually measuring the number of clients or customers served, the number of activities that we provide. We need that information. It's important information for budgeting and planning and to make sure that we're reaching the number of people that we want to reach. If we say we're going to have 200 kids in our program and we have capacity to have 200 kids in the program, we want to make sure that that we do reach 200 kids, and it would be helpful to know that during the year. So 2 months in, 3 months in, 6 months in, we know that we have the right number of kids that are involved in the program. So that would be helpful. So if after 6 months we only have 80 kids involved and our goal is 200, that would be helpful to know that so that we can do things to make sure that we can recruit the right number of people into the program. The second one is how well did we do it? This is where we're looking at the quality of what we do, such as workload ratio, staff turnover rate, staff fully trained, unit cost, things like that. Or most importantly, customer satisfaction. Are we asking people, did we provide something of value and did we treat you well? That is very helpful so we can improve our programs. Also activity-specific measures, number of timely intakes. Are we meeting our accreditation standards? Or I think the most important one is retention rate, tracking whether people stay in the program long enough to get the benefits of the program. Because kids or individuals could be in a program, but if they drop out before the 10 weeks, it's a 10-week program teaching parenting or job skill development, something like that, and most of the people drop out within 5 weeks, or a significant portion drop out. Doesn't matter how good the program is if people don't stay in the program long enough to achieve the benefit or receive the benefit. So it's important that we find ways to track that so we can make those mid-course corrections to make sure that people stay in the program long enough. And then is anyone better off, which is the most important question. Are we, because everything we do should be because it's changing somebody's life some way by providing additional skills, knowledge, attitude, behavior, or circumstances. Was somebody homeless? Now they're not. Was somebody failing? Now they're not. Whatever that may be, all of these are measurable, and we need to make sure that we are measuring these so that we can make sure that we're achieving the results that are necessary. So just to give you some quick examples, using the quadrants here where we have quantity and quality and effort and effect. The upper left-hand quadrant, the number of patients treated. How well did we do it? The percent of patients treated in less than an hour. That's a helpful quality measure. Are people waiting in the waiting line too long or the waiting room too long? And this is where, again, it becomes important to disaggregate the data, because we might find that at this health clinic, people that speak English are treated in less than an hour, but if somebody is English is not their first language, it takes 2 or 3 hours before they're treated. it would be helpful to know that so that we can make those mid-course corrections and make sure that we have the translators necessary so that everyone can get the services when they need them. And again, the most important indicators: is anyone better off, number of children fully immunized, and the percent of children fully immunized. Again, example, how much did we do, number of students in the program or in the school, how well did we do it, the student-teacher ratio, and is anyone better off, the number of high school graduates, and the most important, the percent of high school graduates, because that gives us the information that we need so that we can improve our programs and our activities. So here's another way to look at it. Again, the quadrants answer the questions: how productive are we? Are we doing things right? And most importantly, are we doing the right things to improve lives? And all of this data, whenever possible, we need to disaggregate by race and ethnicity and gender and other factors to make sure that we are getting the true story. That's how we can truly begin to achieve the equity that is necessary in our communities. So related, population and performance. To be clear about that, we have this, our goal, let's say, an example is youth succeeding in school, and we're tracking the indicators of third grade reading, middle school students proficient in math and reading, and the percent of students dropping out of school. And we have this one program, which is the Middle School Intensive Mentoring Project. We need to be very clear that at the top is the population results, the bottom is the performance accountability or the customer results, and the relationship between the two is a contribution or contributory relationship, not cause and effect. We can't prove that this one program is impacting those indicators at a population level because they're not touching all of the kids in the school, but they are contributing by playing a role, so we need to make sure that they are aligned in supporting that effort of making sure all youth succeed in school, but they're only responsible for making sure that the kids that are actually in their program are successful. So another way to look at that is it takes a whole host of activities to turn a curve. And over here we have some interagency collaboration, and we have some place-based neighborhood work, and potentially some policy changes. All of these things together can be thought of as collective impact, because it takes a collective impact effort to truly turn a curve in a community, because everyone is responsible to help turn that curve. So finally, the 7 questions from ends to means. In RBA, we use these questions at both the population accountability level to make sure that we're focusing on our ends first, and we're identifying the indicators that we need, and we're identifying the partners and the strategies that are. And then for individual performance accountability, for individuals, agencies, programs, services, activities, we can answer these same questions or similar questions. Who are our customers? That answers the questions in the upper left-hand quadrant. How can we measure if our customers are better off? We're being very clear about how we're measuring the lower quadrant questions, and then how we're delivering service as well. How are we doing on the most important of these measures, where we actually graph them? Who are our partners that have a role to play? And I want to highlight here that we think it's really important that you start to ask who are our partners before you start thinking about strategies and activities, because that helps to broaden what we call your solution space, or the area in which you need to engage to truly be effective in the work you do. And then you again look at what can we do, what are the strategies, brainstorm activities, including no-cost and low-cost ideas. And that's where I think it's important to look at the role the community can play, the individuals we serve, so they're not just seen as recipients, but also, from my asset-based community development background, we call producers or co-producers of their own in their community's well-being. So how are we engaging the community? And finally, what do we propose to do? What are our action steps? So let me put these 7 questions into action very quickly in RBAs. And we call this turn the curve thinking. So how do we put it all together? So turn the curve in a nutshell begins with the ends in mind, working to the means, and uses data to improve both population and performance accountability. So it starts with what is the end result? What are we trying to achieve, whether that's a result or an indicator or a performance measure? And so we look at that, again, a North Star, what is that result we're trying to achieve, or what are the performance measures? So you can literally take all of your performance measures and do turn the curve thinking on each one of them to improve. So again, you don't have enough people registered in the program participating. What do we need to do to change that? We don't have the right customer satisfaction or the retention rates. What do we need to do to improve that? Or we're not having enough people learn new skills or knowledge. What do we need to do that? So you can use this tool to go through all of this to make a difference. So the second one is, how are we doing? So we do what we call turn the curve thinking. So take that information. So if we're looking at the dropout rate, for example, in a school, and we look at the dropout rate and we notice that the dropout rate over the last 5 years has increased, we can assume that if we do nothing, it will continue to increase, which is not okay. So our goal is to turn the curve. And what becomes very clear from this visual, which is why I like it, is it takes a wide variety of strategies to turn that curve or reducing teen dropouts or school dropout rates. Again, it takes programs, it takes media, it takes public policy, it takes the community being involved. And so another way to think about it, it takes a lot of people pulling on that curve to turn it into the right direction, either pulling it down or pushing it up. It takes the community to do that at a result or an indicator level. And even for an individual program or service, it potentially is going to take more partners to be effective with the programming. So here's a quick example of turning the curve. I think many of you are familiar with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. When they implemented that program, they were able to turn the curve on alcohol-related traffic deaths in our country. The next one is, what is the story behind the curve? That's where we take the information, take that trend line, and ask 5 times, why? What are the root causes? Why do we think kids are dropping out? What are the reasons contributing to them dropping out? What are the things that are helping to make sure they don't drop out? Both positive and negative. Prioritize them so that you can begin to develop your strategies. And you may also develop a research agenda. Well, we really need more information so we can be more effective. You may want to do a force field analysis. What are the factors contributing, the factors restricting? You could actually list those. So that gives you the information that you need to begin to identify your partners and develop your strategies. So as you begin to look at your partners, who are partners who may have a role to play in turning the curve? Does the story behind the curve suggest any new partners? Who's missing around our table? Who's not engaged? How are we engaging the community as participants in this process? And when you list partners, it's important to list specific names or organizations and or people. So we're not just saying, well, we need CBOs or we need the faith community or employers involved, but we're very clear about we need XYZ agency or XYZ church or this person I know that, or the pastor of this church, because you're actually going to use action steps where you're going to contact them to get them around the table, to get them involved, and you need to have actual contact information to do that. The next question is, what works to turn the curve? So what are our options to turn the curve? What are the, and literally brainstorm, the research-based, what policies do we need to change? What are the low-cost, no-cost ideas? Also encourage at this brainstorming stage off-the-wall ideas, because sometimes those are going to provide the most input to create some new solutions to be effective. And you again also may want to create a research agenda. And then finally, what do we propose to do? What is our action steps over the next 60 days, the next 6 months, the next year? And that action plan, will it turn the curve? Do we think it has a chance to leverage what we're trying to do? Is it feasible? Can we do it? Specific, be very clear about it, who, what, where, and when, and how, so that you're actually assigning responsibilities and action. And is value. And it is. So here are the, again, the 7 questions. Is it something to be effective around your programming? And again, making sure that the data I believe we can use is disaggregated data whenever possible, so that you can create greater equity. So just to give you an example of that, again, being very clear that we have to make sure that we are looking at data through a disaggregated lens, because as the picture that highlights there, you know, I'm sure glad the hole isn't in our end. The boat is eventually going to sink if we're not clear about disaggregated data. So disaggregated data, whose lives are we looking to impact? And if unless we disaggregate that data, our efforts may be wasted. So just let me give you a quick example. Through the aggregated lens, and this is actually some screenshots from our Clear Impact scorecard, is this is percent of children, all children, reading at grade level. So if we look at that at a community level or at one school, we might feel pretty good about it. Okay. But by focusing on all children, because if we look at it from the standpoint of all the kids in the school, by race and ethnicity, we may find out that the story is very different. The white kids and the Asian kids are doing very, very well, but the Hispanic and African American kids are struggling a bit. So we do need some different strategies and activities. So we need to do the story behind the curve thinking differently for each grade level, for each ethnicity, or race. So here we can do it for the kids of color, for black, and we could do it for the Hispanic kids to identify what else do we need to do to help increase their results and their reading at grade level. So let me stop there. That was a very brief overview of RBA, but let me stop there and see if you have any questions, and then we're going to move on and talk a bit more about racial equity.
Dan, there's no questions at this time.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move forward then. And it's my pleasure to introduce my co-presenter, and take it away.
Thank you, Dan. So good afternoon, everyone. Simran Noor, and thank you for the earlier very generous introduction. So just wanted to get started to ground us a bit in who we are at the Center for Social Inclusion, the organization that I have the honor to present today, and also just to name that some colleagues from our work will weigh in a little bit later. We hope to both ground this webinar with some background, so I'll talk in a second about some core concepts of racial equity, as Dan just went through beautifully, core concepts of RBA, but then actually talk about some of the stories, right? How is this working? How is it playing out across some of the areas in which Center for Social Inclusion, we're is that we work with this system of structural racial inequity, and we'll talk about that in a second. And we do that in a couple of ways, both policy development, so co-creating ideas and strategy with communities, in particular communities of color. Thinking about the field in terms of leadership development, recognizing we're a national organization that works in over 300 places, so we can't do this work, right? And it's really powerful to actually transfer knowledge, power, resources to folks doing the work in place. So part of our work is very much about building the field. We also do message testing and do work around how do we talk about race effectively, using brain science and research in that way to come up with a methodology for that. And then finally, we do deep work around organizational change, and that's where the Government Alliance on Race and Equity comes in. You see that in the slide that this work is really a national network of government, primarily local regional government, to achieve racial equity and advance opportunities for all. And that work is really about providing tools and resources to jurisdictions to put theory into action. And so that's just broadly a bit about our work, and would ask for the next slide. Great. So just wanted to frame this up by talking about, what are the ways in which we think about addressing racial equity, right? We know that there are some standard methods. Those methods in general tend not to acknowledge historical and cultural context. So we're not necessarily recognizing the root causes or the context by which we've reached the conditions, the disparities that we are in today. Standard methods also tend to focus on individuals, right? The most visible form of racism folks can really hold is individual racism, racism happening as actions between folks. And so behaviors and attitudes, the change of behavior is one way in which standard methods play out. I'm not sure what happened to the slide, but if we could go back to the slide, it would be really helpful. So I'll just continue.
There, are you not seeing it? Because it should be there.
No, I'm actually seeing the CSI background slide. I'm not sure if others, yeah, it's back now. Standard methods also intervene only on the under-advantaged side of inequality. So, and privilege status, the privileged status of whiteness remains unquestioned and the standard of comparison, right? So not a nuanced understanding around the differences between inequality and inequity, and really no recognition of the power dynamics at play or how white supremacy and whiteness affect even the ways in which we think about measurement, right? And standard methods in general focus much more on the short term. Whereas we know in a structural method, the disparities that we see need to be rooted in historical and cultural understanding. We know it's taken decades to and through multiple policies and practices to get to the conditions that we see in communities of color in particular. And so those require a long-term approach. They require us to challenge as individuals, interpersonally, structurally, and institutionally, the privileged status of whiteness. And they really target multiple institutions interacting and put into question the level of intervention. So, recognizing that as a bit of a context, want to move to, what have we found as effective practice in moving this conversation about racial equity across an institution? So that very much involves kind of three big buckets of work. And many of you, over 80% of folks on the call named that they were familiar with racial equity, so some of this may be review. But just hang tight because we want to make sure to contextualize the conversation, right? So we have to normalize this conversation about race. How can we as an institution hold a shared definition and analysis? There also has to be some urgency and priority placed on these topics. We are all holding multiple priorities at any given time, and we know that if this conversation about racial equity, whether that's in measurement or through an institution's actions or engagement or whatever an institution is working on, that if equity, racial equity in particular, isn't a priority, it often isn't addressed. Excuse me. We also know that in order to have this conversation and it be sustainable, we have to organize, both within our institutions and across our institutions. So internal infrastructure has to be built for an institution to hold the conversation, and partnerships need to be in place for our own accountability, but also to inform our strategies and our thinking. And then where we really see RBA fitting in as a framework is really thinking about what are the tools that help us develop strategies and drive results. And perhaps the most exciting piece of the RBA framework is really what Dan named, which was really being able to uncover not just what we did or what an intervention did, but who's better off? What's the impact? And are people of color in particular better off? And finally, we know to get to a different set of outcomes, we have to be able to visualize that change, not just as institutions, but with our stakeholders and with community. So really thinking about a methodology for institutional change toward racial equity, holding multiple components, we find to be very important and the most effective in moving the conversation forward. Slide, please. So to get folks engaged a bit, want to do a quick poll. And if you could just answer using the quick poll there. Really want to get a sense of where folks are, how folks are holding of the $120 billion in home loans underwritten by the federal government between 1933 and 62. What percent went to white homeowners? All right.
Okay, I think that's probably close enough. We want to close that poll.
So 52% of you have answered 98%, which is the right answer. So, you know, we don't have a ton of time today, but really important to recognize how our housing policy has created differences in wealth and access for people of color. And beginning in the 1930s and 40s, the federal government created programs, along with real estate agencies and banks, created programs that subsidized low-cost home loans for people, and this opened home ownership to millions of Americans. What we know is that that people of color, particularly Black folks, were not could not access those loans, and so we really, and this is where our history in this country of redlining, which is the practice of drawing red lines around neighborhoods that were majority people of color and deeming them not credit worthy, where that practice really comes from. And what's most interesting today is if we were to compare those maps, we talk about the U.S. as being an incredibly segregated society, and if we were to pull up those maps from the 30s and 40s where redlining became a practice, much of what we see today is still resonant with those very red lines. So happy to share some resources more on some of the history behind those policies, but wanted to ask that quiz question and have another one for folks. What is the net worth of the average white family in compared to the average Black family? Just give you all a few more seconds there.
Okay, it looks like everyone has voted.
All right, thank you. Really advanced group here. So 8 times as much is the correct answer. And, you know, interestingly enough, this is for average. Yet we know that even at the same income levels, whites still have on average twice as much wealth as as people of color. And, you know, there's been really interesting research done that's traced, you know, what are the structural reasons behind it, and recognize that both home ownership and unemployment only account for about 5% of that difference, and 45% of that difference is accounted for by home ownership. And we know, or we can imagine, that home ownership is both a product of, you know, our income and that bit, but also in our inheritance and how wealth is passed through generationally, and recognizing that fundamentally people of color, because of the last poll question that we asked, right, recognizing the history behind who was blocked from home ownership, and tracing that to today in terms of the calculation around wealth, huge disparities there that policy has both created and sustained. So just going to move on to provide some context. So really important to recognize that race, you know, some assumptions that we make and some facts that we know about race, right? I want to pause for a second and just name that this is quite a moment in our country in terms of context. Don't know about folks on the call, but webinar rather, but it has been an incredibly difficult few weeks and years. But just want to recognize that that we have a very complicated and tense conversation about race happening across the country today. And we know that race is a construct, right? So there's no biological differences between races, that it is a social construct, and it's how we've placed value on one particular group over others, and that group being white whiteness as a category. Policy has driven the social construction of race. So who was considered white has changed over time. And policy, both immigration policy, Supreme Court rulings, etc., have deeply informed that. And the third piece we like to frame up front is that none of us on this webinar, none of us in our institutions created the system. We weren't, no individual did that. And yet, collectively, we have a responsibility to address it. So if we were together in a room on this next slide, excuse me, I would ask, all men are created equal. Where have you seen that statement before? And folks would name the Declaration of Independence. So clearly, as a nation, we hold a value around that statement. And yet, when that statement was written, we were really only talking about white male property owners being created equal, right? With liberty and justice for all, again, would ask, where does that come from? The Pledge of Allegiance that millions of children still name today, and recognizing just in our current context that with liberty and justice for all, while it may be an aspirational value, perhaps not quite as realized as we would like. And finally, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg Address. Again, quite a gap between what we'd like to be and where we currently are. And so want to talk a little bit about the history of government and race on the next slide. So we know that there was a period in time in history, and again, happy to direct resources, both articles and films that can talk through this more for anyone that would like it, but that government explicitly created and maintained racial inequity. We were initially explicit, right? We had slavery in this country and many, many, many other forms of native disposition of lands, native and indigenous, I should say, etc., and that carried through generationally, explicitly. After the civil rights movement and struggle, that kind of overt, explicit racism in the institutional way through policy became illegal. But we still have race-neutral policies, right? We still see that if we don't name race, we continue to perpetuate inequity. And so what we really advocate for at the Center for Social Inclusion is having to have proactive policies, practices, and procedures that both name race and advance racial equity. Not a surprise to anyone on the next slide, but we have racial inequity in this country, and race continues to predict how we do. The reason that we don't focus on there's many forms of marginalized identity. There's many structures that disadvantage particular groups, whether we're thinking about class lines, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. And we focus on race because race is a singular construct that determines really how well we do. We know that from life expectancy to infant mortality, race is a primary predictor, and even when we hold constant for income, for example, we still see racial disparities. And just a quick note about the difference between equity and equality. Equality being sameness, so everyone gets the same, and equity implying that we have to apply a little bit of reason and a little bit of justice because we're not all starting at the same place, right? And so an equity approach is really about ensuring that all groups have what they need to succeed. I'm going to go on to the next slide. Just quickly want to talk about implicit bias. So we know that it's really important to understand how people think and how race plays in that, right? So human beings in general, not in general, but overall, create and construct meaning in two ways: individual meaning, so how we individually are holding a concept or idea, and collective meaning, what the society, the world around us is telling us about a particular topic. So what we know is that we tend to think that we're individuals in our thinking, and yet 98% of what we think we've constructed through collective meaning, and only 2% of our emotional cognition is actually conscious to us. So every second we're taking in 42 billion bits of information, and about 14 or 15 particles are we actually conscious of? And our thoughts about race tend to reside in that unconscious network. Slide. So schemas are the frames which help our brains navigate the world. Schemas are, they sort, we think by association, we sort by categories, and we fill in the gaps. Our brain would literally go into overload if we didn't have, if we didn't have collective meaning constructing the way that we see the world. And bias is essentially, on the next slide, the evaluation of one group and its members relative to another. So we all carry bias. Again, if our brain didn't have the ability to sort and make those associations, it would literally be out of control. And so a bias within itself is a natural reaction, and acting on bias, however, is where we see that there can be negative outcomes created, particularly for people of color. And that, we say bias is expressed in two ways on the next slide. Explicit bias, which is direct bias. It's expressed directly. We're aware of that bias. It's conscious to us. And that would be an example like a sign in the window of an apartment building, we don't rent to X racial group. But there's also implicit bias. This is the place where we think very important to name race, right? So that's expressed indirectly. It's that part of our brain that we're not even aware of that we're making associations around race. And that would be a property manager doing more criminal background checks on African Americans than white folks. And when we ask that property manager, if we were to ask, are you doing this practice, they would say no, right? Because that practice, that bias is operating implicitly without their knowledge, and yet having real impacts on folks' life outcomes. Next slide. So really important to note two things. So one is that suppressing or denying bias actually increases it, right? So it's really important to openly acknowledge our assumptions and the biases that we hold. Harvard University has an implicit associations test that could help you determine what your biases are, what your tendencies are. Really important to know what they are so we can surface them, right? And make visible the invisible ways that they are affecting how we think and make decisions. Also important to note that implicit bias doesn't just play at an individual level, but actually plays across an institution as well. So three types of racism, really important to note here. Individual racism is the most visible. It's what we see. It's the discrimination of an individual based on race. But there's other forms of racism, right? Institutional racism, which are the policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white folks and often unintentionally or inadvertently are harmful toward people of color. And there's a dozen examples of this, and I'm going to just walk through because I think really important to also name structural racism, which is a history and current reality of multiple institutions carrying that institutional racism, right? So we could look at education policy within an institution that is like higher expectations for white students than students of color, but that cumulatively combined with, for example, a transportation system that doesn't take kids of color to schools, a home environment or a neighborhood environment that has toxic waste, for example, et cetera, like those, the cumulative effect of all of those things would be what structural racism is. And that's fine to go to the next slide. So racial equity, what do we mean when we're saying it? Racial equity is when race is no longer a determinant of life outcomes. And what's important to note here is that when we are able to target people of color because they tend to be the worst off due to structural racism, that it actually improves outcomes for everyone, including white folks. And on the second bullet of this slide, just want to note, this is a definition that was generated by community leaders that we worked with. Just want to note that equity, racial equity in particular, is both a process and an outcome, right? So important to be holding how we're doing something as well as what we're trying to do by doing something differently. Slide. So just to hone in on structural racism just for a minute, structures are part of our lives. All of these things cumulatively contribute to our health and well-being, and they're all connected, right? So where we live is, and access to where we work, et cetera, all deeply important to recognize these elements being important to our lives. And structural racism in that way points to multiple institutions. It's the way in which those institutions interact with one another. I like to say on this slide that disparities are not natural. Policy, practice, we've created them, and then it's on us as a society to think about what are the policy entry points to begin to disrupt and dismantle. And that structures are just going to do what they do, invisibly reinforcing disparities and disinvestment. So again, being racially explicit, incredibly important. So I want to talk just for a minute about what are some of the foundational policies. We talked a little bit about the Federal Housing Administration along with banks and real estate agencies creating a very particular picture around housing in this country that's still very resonant today. The second picture is really about, this is a map of our nation's capital, the lovely Washington, D.C., and seeing a concentration of the yellow and red dots being transfer stations, and the dark green being up to 99%, between 86.9 and 99% people of color, a deep overlap between where people of color live, for example, and where trash facilities are located. And we could kind of look across spatially a number of indicators in that way and find that concentration of toxins, hazardous waste sites, et cetera, in communities of color. And then how do we take proactive approaches? So one of the last picture really is accompanied by a story from the city of Seattle, Race and Social Justice Initiative, and the use of a racial equity tool by a city worker to do an analysis around street lighting, right? So which neighborhoods didn't have street lights, who was really deeply impacted by that. We often talk about street lighting as a public safety issue, right? And so did a racial equity analysis, a city worker, and found that disproportionately communities of color, in this case Rainier Beach, I believe, in Seattle, southwest part of the city, highest immigrant population, highest number of people of color, most low-income community, had the highest number of streetlights out. Found that system of street lighting was, bulbs were replaced by a sign being posted on each street lamp to call the city when the street light was out, recognizing in particular in communities of color a host of issues that could prevent folks from actually being able to call in, right, whether that was access to a phone, limited English proficiency, mistrust in government, et cetera, some issues there. So City of Seattle, after doing that analysis, using a tool around that, were really able to shift the way they deploy streetlights to actually a geographic-based system. So when a streetlight now goes in, that's noted. After a certain amount of years, the life expectancy of a street light, of a bulb, has grown. So after maybe 3 to 5 years at this point, street light is replaced whether or not it's burnt out. What was found was that it actually saved the city money in a time of a budget deficit. So recognizing again, when we have tools and strategies that really surface what's not working for people of color who, because of structural racism, tend to be the most vulnerable, we can actually improve conditions for everyone. So with that, would like to move to questions and open it up to folks to ask.
Sure. So yes, we do have a few questions, and the first of which, is there a resource or two that you can identify for the best place to find that data broken down by race?
Sure, absolutely. So not sure on specifically the indicators that we're looking for, but and I would welcome Dan to weigh in here as well. But depending on the sector, depending on I think census data, American Community Survey data are good general places where race is broken down, but also Kids Count, the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Kids Count database is another source for that. Dan, do you have others?
I think the main thing is to create an expectation in a community that we need to have data that is disaggregated by race. And so working with the institutions that collect data in your community to make sure they're doing that. So for example, it becomes part of what we call your data development agenda. And so if the data is not available, you may need to go to your school district and say, we need to have that data disaggregated, or go to the health department, wherever that may be. But as you've highlighted, already the census, the American Community Survey, and Kids Count and some other data sources are understanding this. But in a community, it may be part of your strategy is to find ways to get that data disaggregated.
Great. Terrific. And there's also a request from our attendees to provide any additional examples of any race-neutral policies that may exist.
Sure. So a historical example in that way is actually the Social Security Act. So when the Social Security Act was passed, it didn't name race, right? So but two classes of workers, for example, included agricultural workers and domestic workers, and that actually excluded 80% of the black workforce in the South and 2/3 of the black workforce overall when it was passed in the 30s. And those amendments weren't actually removed, until the mid-50s. So I would say being able to look at any policy and looking at the impact of that policy. Is there a racialized impact, whether or not the policy names race? Because of the conditions that we're building policy on, in general, most of our policies may have a disparate impact, a particular disproportionate impact, rather, on communities of color. And most of our policies tend to be race neutral. And I think in the same lens and vein that Dan talked about advocating for the kind of data that can nuance that conversation, right? Being able to advocate for having a lens around a policy lens that's explicit and a mechanism, and I would advocate as a starting place for a racial equity tool. It's on GARE's website in that way. That can walk through some questions looking at a policy or a decision point to see who benefits and who is burdened by this. And that can really give us a sense of race-neutral policies, practices, and decisions that have disproportionate impacts on people of color. So race-neutral essentially really talks about not actively naming race or having a targeted strategy around addressing the particular conditions that people of color face.
Well, I wanted to add to the previous question, one of our more than 400 participants on the webinar today, so congratulations everyone, shows the importance of this topic, but they also highlighted that PolicyLink has a wonderful national equity atlas available online. So again, Google PolicyLink and their National Equity Atlas, and you can find a lot of good disaggregated data there as well.
Of course, yes.
Great, terrific. Thank you for that. And also see state data books as an additional resource that people can check out. So there's a question that is emerging around sort of identifying prejudices and biases within the leadership of results-based accountability frameworks or any type of collective impact framework. I guess the question is around how does one begin to identify their own biases and prejudices as they relate to the work that we do, and how do you begin to work within those constructs to sort of course correct to make sure that things are in check?
Yeah, so I'll start and would also welcome Dan, because I think this is a process question, right? So there's a lot of different methods by which to surface how our biases, whether implicit or explicit, may be affecting our work. I do think the implicit associations test is a good place to start. I think depending on where you work, being able to have that as an organizational value, right? Being able to have an accountability partner, for example, within your institution, within your community, that you trust to talk about this. I know, for example, there's trainings that talk about how racism plays out in internalized and interpersonal ways. Trainings like the People's Institute do work like that, but also there's tools and materials that allow for organizations to do audits around examining their own practice. Is it disadvantaging particular groups of color? Is it advantaging white folks? So being able to have kind of some systemic review of that, I think, could be very helpful. And so just, on the first end of the question, and I think it's a really important process piece. One of the things that in designing performance indicators, I think that Dan mentioned that I think is important, is who are the key stakeholders that help inform how we're thinking about measurement, right? How are we not kind of very squarely thinking about an issue? And I think some of the stories will highlight the nuance, like as we begin to peel back the layers of this conversation, can have a much richer dialogue about where and how how folks have innovated to think about how racial equity in particular can exist within this framework. So I'll stop there and see if, Dan, you would add any other specifics.
Well, I'm kind of looking at the time right now, and I think what would be helpful is because we've got 3 examples of how this is being used on the ground, and I think if we took a moment from that and went through the 3 examples and then went back to the questions, I think it would really answer some of the questions in a more practical way.
Great.
Okay, sounds good.
So first example I have the pleasure to talk through, and then colleagues from Fairfax County, and I'll let them introduce themselves, will talk through the next example. But just quickly wanted to highlight Dane County, Wisconsin. So Dane County, we engaged Government Alliance on Race and Equity, engaged in a process around thinking about and this is the systematic kind of like audit that I was talking about the current status of racial equity. What was really important, so this is just a bit of process, but what was really important, I think on the next slide, was really thinking about impact and how we measure that, right? So Dane County's entire framework at this point in terms of how they're thinking about impact, it's starting with community. So being in that way, the RBA framework allows us to think about impact linking kind of what is the outcome that we want to see in community, and what is the what are the actions that we can do to contribute to that outcome. So when we think about and that's not in general a frame that's widely held. Usually we think about in that way, in that first slide when I talked about holding individual actions, we think about program outcomes, or think about program outcomes, for example, and not necessarily impact, but being able to map and link community indicators with performance indicators, a really powerful piece that Dane County began to embark on as a result of having RBA and also a real focus on racial equity. And in that way, really being able to disaggregate and target strategies that allow us to think about, what particularly works for people of color within community, and then, for the general population in that way. So I would ask to move to the next slide, and just wanted to give a big welcome and shout out to Marlon Murphy and Deborah Gutierrez, who will talk a bit about the County of Fairfax, Virginia, and their work around measurement, as well as going deep about thinking about RBA with a racial equity lens.
Hello, I'm Deborah Gutierrez with Fairfax County, system planner with Fairfax County, and I'll be the first one up. Thank you, Dan and Simran, for allowing me to share a brief overview of our implementation approach and highlighting a few of the challenges we have had and continue to face. In order to support the implementation of a results-based accountability framework within Fairfax County's Health and Human Services, we spent time initially developing 6 results, as highlighted on this slide, and engaging the community regarding the ongoing work, and identifying county programs and services that contribute to system indicators designed to enable us to track system-level performance within the 6 results. Early foundational work began with training agency staff on results-based accountability as a framework for measuring population and program performance, as well as communicating shared accountability for achieving these results to clients served by Health and Human Services. Next, we as system planners engage staff within each of the 9 Health and Human Services agencies and work with them to develop program performance plans, identifying key better off measures to highlight what differences were being made in the lives of the clients being served. For the better part of the year, we engaged as many staff as possible at the various organizational levels by working closely with program managers, direct service staff, and strategic planners within the 9 agencies to ensure as many programs and services as possible were represented with a program performance plan. Next slide, please. The next thing that occurred were that system goals, as highlighted on this slide, were developed at the senior leadership level within each result to target the work being done now and to also guide decision-making in the future to best address identified needs and challenges faced by all county residents. Within each of the 6 results, the desired outcomes are centered on improving the well-being of all county residents. Currently, through some work that we're doing within 6 strategic work groups designed to be cross-system in nature with representation from county agency staff and the community, a report card utilizing many of the same elements that were referenced earlier by Dan is being constructed for each of the results and is designed to highlight, first off, to highlight how we are performing with regards to system indicators that represent a composite of related program better off measures, and 2, to communicate strategies, objectives, and action steps to improve performance over time or to turn the curve. Through this process, the county's Health and Human Services system has validated one of its biggest challenges, which is that of current information systems and databases that are used within the various agencies. They're really not collecting data in the same way, and definitely most are not collecting it in a disaggregated way. They're simply not able to easily report out disaggregated data. With more disaggregated data collected throughout all 9 agencies, we would improve our overall decision-making at the system level and have a clear picture of whether or not we are truly improving results for all residents, which speaks to Dan's earlier reference to turn the curve, thinking through the aggregated lens versus the disaggregated lens. Implementing results-based accountability exposed another challenge for us, and that is of changing a culture and reframing the way we look at and understand performance accountability and results. As we all know, change is never easy. However, as a system, we are now focusing more on the best outcomes for all our clients and have moved from only tracking how much and how well measures to also tracking better off measures. The system report card is simply a tool for our human services system that is designed to first track performance within the 6 results and their respective goals. Secondly, to communicate the accountability framework, why we are measuring performance, how we are doing, and what we want to focus on to improve performance and achieve the desired outcomes. Thirdly, it's designed to provide the foundation needed to engage the broader community in dialogues about results for all residents and communicate to the public how shared accountability for outcomes is critical and that their participation is essential for collective impact to happen. Lastly, to tell the story of the collective work that's being accomplished in our county and sharing what demonstrates true success. Included in that story behind the numbers are identified opportunities for improvement that will guide further discussions and inform decisions about future resource allocations and investments. Because this work remains ongoing, some of our next steps are finalizing report cards that will be released in a web-based version for the public in the near future. Additionally, within the 6 strategic work groups, work is shifting to begin implementation on action plans regarding key strategies. As system planners, we continue to stress with agencies the need for reporting program performance measures annually in a disaggregated way, if at all possible, in order to provide a better picture of what the true numbers are and to reflect fully what difference is being made in the lives of all residents being served. Lastly, within Fairfax County, a multi-year health and human services initiative called the IT Roadmap is underway to improve capabilities of our own information systems and databases to uniformly collect, track, and report disaggregated data. This effort will improve the system's capacity to better monitor performance measurement and address disparities in client outcomes. At this point, I'll turn it over now to Marlon Murphy with our Juvenile and Domestic Relations General District Court to speak further on how his agency is applying the results-based accountability framework and using disaggregated data. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Dan, and thank you, Simran. Just drilling down on what Deborah said already, I'm going to kind of share with you a program level implementation of RBA. As one of the departments in human services, we responded to our leadership's call to implement performance measures in all of our service areas, and a lot of these service areas we call programs. We have 21 delivery areas of various types, and they range from direct services, such as our residential-based services and our detention center, as well as indirect services, such as probation or mediation services, but then also our gateway services, which are access to other services, such as our juvenile intake department, which, for those of you who are not familiar, serves as the magistrate's office for juvenile crimes. So if the police or someone brought someone in custody, they would actually make a decision on whether probable cause has been found, but also is there access for divergent services and other means of alternative services other than the court. We initially engaged RBA as a way to explain and validate the services that we were providing. And that's how a large aspect of our workforce and our agency levels viewed it. The key aspect of the process was actually the selection of the individuals to work on the development of the respective plans. So each one of these 21 areas all had an RBA plan to explain their services, explain their story, all the factors that were involved in delivery of their services, both financial as well as collaborative resources, as an example. In the development of the plan, I think one of the key things for us was one of the things that Deborah spoke about was that facilitator, because you wanted someone to actually help you through the process that actually wasn't necessarily involved in the thinking and the day-to-day service delivery. So that was the key thing in the development of our plan. Next slide, please. What I wanted to show here is that these are actually 2 pages from 2 separate plans during the first implementation year. And each program director and the identified team had the discretion to create the respective RBA plan that they felt best told their story. And these 2 examples display the variation and the differences in the actual service mission of a gateway services, our juvenile intake department on the left, as well as one of our residential programs on our right. The measures that were identified connect the human service 6 results that were identified by Deborah. So if we look on the left-hand side, some of the example measures in our how much was done measurements were percentage of complaints by race. Those are percentages of children that were brought to the doorsteps of the court that could possibly be charged. When you drop down on how well it was done, an example measure was percentage of parents that were satisfied by the support groups they attended. And is anyone better off? Some of our measures were percentage of customers better educated about the process of the court, percentage of customers better informed about community resources, as well as percentage of juveniles afforded alternatives to detention while protecting the community through the use of an intake detention alternative. When you shifting over to the right and look at one of our residential program, where the key mission of that program is actually to achieve behavioral change, some of the measures were a little bit different. And when you look at in how much was done, we saw the percentage of placements based on race and ethnicity. When you came down how well it was done, you looked at the percentage of parents that were actually satisfied with the program. But when you come down to the better off measures, you see more behavioral change or longitudinal measures where percentage of youth who remained in school graduated, obtained their GED 6 months after completion of the program, percentage of youth who increased family function upon program completion, percentage of youth who improved mental health functioning upon program completion, and percentage of youth who improved pro-social skills upon program completion. I think one of the things that really stood out to us during this process, because we approached this initially as a program measure process, in addition to the same time that we were beefing up our race equity initiative, that we actually did not mesh the two initially, but we subsequently have begun, and that's where we're going. Initially, these years was a challenge for the court personnel to wrestle with better off measures. That was a new way of thinking for us. We were very good at collecting data and thinking how much and how well measured were very easy, but the better off measures was a new way of thinking for us. Thoughts had to shift with the end in mind. We began to ask ourselves, how would we like our clients to be following the completion of our service delivery? That was a vital aspect of our thinking groups, the groups that were put in place to develop our RBA plans. In some aspects of our work, especially for those programs that did solution-based theory and treatment planning, that was new before. That wasn't that new before. A large entity of our agency, the RBA way of thinking was actually new. But the good thing about the RBA was that it goes a long way into making this type of thinking consistent and purposeful on an annual basis. And one of the key things about this process that was very valuable for us, and I would suggest it for anybody going forward, is the selection of who has become part of the process, their knowledge of the system, knowledge of the goals, and their skill set. Next slide, please. When we go and look at next slide, when it came to equity, our equity effort, and what in the justice system we call disproportional minority contact with DMC, these measures were really reflected in our how much measures. And so what we see here is that, and when we look at the percentage of the complaints that were brought to our court system, we do see overrepresentation of Black and Hispanic youth, because in our locality of just over 1.1 million people, the Black population does not make up 27% in our area. I think our Black population is more like 12%, and our Hispanic population is more like 15%. And so what we started to do was, at the end of our RBA year, after we completed these measures, and then now we start to go forward, we got this. Well, this put us in a position where now we can ask ourselves why. Why are we getting some of these outcomes? So that way we can create new measures and really dig down deep. And so this is some of the things that would change for us. I think we were very good at asking why, but when it came to the better off measures and thinking about what are the better off measures, and it's fine to be on that slide. No, it's fine. You can go forward, because I'm telling that this is a better off measure from that residential program, where you see during the same period of time the disproportionality of Black youth and Hispanic youth for a residential program. And so our question then became why. And so this is the evolution in our process, where we're starting to look at a merger of our race equity effort as well as our RBA plan. And it was at these points that we began to see that this was an essential need, an essential merger. Extending new better off measures to equity is where we've arrived. This requires conscious thought and will require a combination of race equity tools to analyze data and potential solutions, but RBA as an aspect of annual accountability arm to say, okay, what is going to be our way of looking at this from an annual basis? And this is where we are now implementing our turn the curve thinking, leading to us researching in some areas some of the things that we need to really bend and really change some of the lead out some of the outcomes. And so how are we positively interrupting some of our processes? So for example, we've now started to look at our use of detention in terms of the violation of probation cases, and what are some of the things that are driving those numbers that we're seeing. One of the areas that we're looking at also is the use of plea bargains in our system, and these are the cases that end up with children being placed on probation where maybe our court workers weren't even involved in the process of making a recommendation, and if you have a situation where the defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney maybe arrive to a plea bargain to place a youth on probation, but without the court saying, hey, or the court workforce saying that that child needs to be on probation at all. Beginning to examine the curriculum procedures in our residential programs to see that who are they working better off for, and what are some of the things that benefit some populations versus another. So we're looking at lengthening some of the things we've discovered that, hey, maybe we need to lengthen our aftercare for some populations because it works better. Do we provide transportations to meetings or groups, or in some situations we've offered dinner in some situations for families or youth when they're coming to the aftercare meetings. So these are some of the things that RBA has teased out for us on a program level that has changed our thinking, but it's also merged with our race equity efforts to really look at how we're serving our communities and how people are doing with our services. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. That was Marlon and Debbie. That was really amazing and a wonderful story of how you've used RBA and turn the curve thinking and data to make strategic decisions and kind of change the culture of your organization. Moving on to the city of Dubuque in Iowa. This is their results scorecard, or their clear impact scorecard that they're using. And just to highlight again, they set it up so they could start to look at the median income in their community and compare it, again, disaggregating that data so they had a sense of the median income. And from that, they developed their racial equity toolkit. Using that, they first identified some key issues in their community, as the result was to have equity and economic well-being was one of their key results in their community. And they looked at the disaggregated data so they had a sense of how each of the in their community. And then at the city level, they began to develop some key strategies to change that. And so using the scorecard, they were able to, and this is the kind of the dashboard, the aggregated scorecard, but this is showing different departments how they roll up, looking at tracking the number of job candidates by race, the number of staff currently in the city by race, and their new hires, so that they can develop specific strategies to increase the number of people of color that are hired by the city, so that they can increase some economic development and activities. They also looked at some key other strategies to recruit and train a workforce reflective of the community, and their key programs or strategy areas revolve around supporting continuous learning. So the number of workshops on equity, the dialogue sessions on equity, supporting employment development and advancement, the number of employees moving into an advanced position, the number of employees attending professional development opportunities, again, disaggregating that by race so they can see if one group is getting promoted over another group. Their policies and ordinances, the number of policies and ordinances assessed for equity, because they're using the GARE, they've adopted the GARE Racial Equity Toolkit so that they're looking at things like policies and procedures. And then services, other things offered to the entire population, designed to work the same for everyone. The number of services assessed for equity, the number of services documents translated to different languages, etc. So that they're able to look at that and literally look at it for every department in the city so that all the departments are focusing on this. Again, so also looking at the boards and commissions and how they are focused on the community and representing the community. So here's an example now. We've taken the number of black candidates and disaggregated that by the various departments so that they can see, and this is just a sample of Public Works, the Police Department, and their Human Relations Department, so they can begin to see the number of candidates over time, so they can look at the curve, look at the trend lines, and then they can do the story behind the curve dialogue on what do we need to do to increase the number of African American candidates coming to the various departments. Also, they can look at the disaggregated data by the individual departments. So here is the one department, which is the Human Relations Department. And again, looking at their candidates and what do they need to do to continue to increase the number of African American or black candidates that are applying for jobs in their department. So that's a sample again of how the scorecard and the racial equity toolkit is being used in Dubuque, Iowa, and literally they are requiring and engaging all of the departments in the city to begin to look through a racial equity lens in doing all of their work. So at that point, we're run out of time, so we'll give it back to our host to let us know next steps. Marquez, are you there? Okay. So, in closing, we have run out of time, and we have a whole host of questions that I know we want to get answered, but I'm thinking probably what we need to do is we will have a list of all the questions and who sent them in, and so I think we'll probably have the ability to develop a email with all of the questions answered and get them back to everybody that participated in the webinar. In addition, I want to remind everyone that they that everybody will get a copy once you do the survey, and at the end of the webinar you'll have an opportunity to get a survey, and if you fill out that survey it'll give you a link to download the recorded version of the webinar as well as the PowerPoint presentation, so everyone will have a copy of that. You can also join our social media family if you're intrigued with this work, and finally, if you have any specific questions for either myself or Simran, please feel free to email us, or you can visit our websites as well to begin to do that. But please feel free to stay engaged with us in this work as we move forward. So again, we will reach out to make sure that all the questions that were presented were answered, and we'll try to get those out to everyone so that you have a chance to continue this dialogue and implement this important work so that we can achieve greater racial equity in our country, which has certainly come to the forefront over the last couple of weeks. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and please let us know if you have any other questions by emailing either of us. Thank you very much.